Wow. Oh, hey there. My name's Ross, and I'm a bit of a nerd for all things nature. So a while ago, I started a passion project called, Nerdy About Nature. It began as social media videos sharing cool fun facts and tidbits of wisdom about the natural world, and has since evolved into this podcast that you're tuning into here. This project serves as a means to inspire, educate, and engage folks with the outdoor world so that we can all become better stewards of it, and so that we can all work together to create a more inclusive, diverse, equitable, and just future for each and every one of us in this world that we all share. Because nature, it's pretty dang neat, you know? I think we should keep it that way. So come on, let's go get nerdy about nature. Come and take a nature walk with me. We're gonna check out some really cool trees. We're gonna hang around and talk about all those things in nature that we can't live without. Let's go get nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature, baby. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Come on, let's get nerdy about nature. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Nerdy About Nature podcast. My name is Ross, and today I'm speaking with Chelsea Greer, who's the Wolf Conservation Program Coordinator at Raincoast Conservation. And today we're talking about all things related to wolves, conservation ethics, population dynamics, and the very sensitive wolf cull that's currently happening in BC and its relation to endangered mountain caribou. So, real great episode for you here, and I hope you enjoy. Let's get into it. Well, thank you for coming all this way up to Squamish to chat. Chelsea Greer, tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
Okay. Well, my name is Chelsea. My pronouns are she, her. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Vancouver, BC, so the territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. And yeah, I mean, what about me? I mean, I guess I'm kind of thinking about, where I got to where I am now. And I think a little bit about me that's kind of led me there is my love for animals. And I've always had this kind of really immense compassion and love for animals. But I didn't ever really know that, you could make a career out of it. So it's kind of, led to me to where I am. But it's kind of been a long journey. Mm-hmm. Did
you ever look at going to vet school or anything like that?
I considered it. I volunteered at a vet clinic for a while, but it just didn't click with me. And I also kind of understood through talking to a lot of people I went to school with and vets, like vet life is tough. Getting into vet school is really hard, and not that like if the passion's there, it just kind of highlights the fact that you really need the passion to go through all of that and endure the hardships of, what comes with.
It's medical studies. So it's totally different too. Like the type of animals you're working with, mostly, I guess you can work in wildlife kind of rehabilitation with that, but it's more just fixing problems and fixing sick things versus protecting things. It's a totally different element of working with animals.
Yeah, and I volunteered. I did my practicum actually at the Vancouver's Marine Mammal Rescue Center. So a lot of their work has to do with rescuing seal pups, sea lions, some cetaceans. No cetaceans while I was there. So whales.
Dang.
and
that'd be fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. From hearing from the vet techs that worked there, if there is, a porpoise that comes in, it is 24 around the clock care, because a lot of them can't properly swim and they might be injured, so we have to.
Interesting.
But yeah, it was a very interesting hands-on experience. We were given a lot of responsibility, feeding the animals, caring for them, assisting in the medical checks, and there was a lot of there's a vet that is part of the Vancouver Aquarium, and there would be a residency for a wildlife vet that would partake in that. And she kind of talked about how, it's a really long journey. And I think working with companion animals versus wildlife, there's just a lot of hard stuff that comes with that too, because you deal with a lot of sick and injured and dying animals where you have to make those decisions based on, is their quality of life going to be there if we keep them alive?
Right. And it's difficult to, there's just the whole empathy notion of it. You can connect so much more to things with big eyes that you can see the emotion in versus a sick jellyfish.
Yeah.
Or you're like, what is a jellyfish? How do I relate to this as like a living being, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
working with dogs and cats and stuff. So growing up, did you have a lot of pets?
I had a cat and a dog, and
Which one did you favor? Were you a dog person, cat person?
I'm like an all animals person, and I'd say that looking back at it now, like I would say my family, my parents weren't really pet people, and they got me a pet because I wanted one, and I didn't necessarily have that sense of responsibility for the pet, but also a lot of the work was put onto my mom. So then my dog developed, she was left alone a couple times and developed, like she became really neurotic because she had the alarm go on off on her a couple times. And so we ended up having to find her a new home. And now that I look back on it, I'm like, yeah, that was the right thing to do. Now that I understand like what is needed to, you know, give an animal a good home.
Right.
And I think she ended up with, you know, an elderly lady that was around all the time of like what kind of what she needed.
Oh, that's sad.
But I haven't grown up with like, because I live in Vancouver and the pet policy for a lot of apartments is quite strict. I have not ever owned a dog or a cat, except when I was in Calgary for grad school. My roommate had 2 really large rescue dogs, kind of a Mastiff mix and a German Shepherd. And so I think those 2 dogs were kind of a huge contributor to getting me through COVID. And then I also fostered an obese tabby cat.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
We
named him Gary.
Yeah.
I made an Instagram account for him, __ Gary.
Fat Gary.
He's so photogenic.
You had to do the double underscore because there's already so many fat Garys out there.
Yeah. And for double wide, you know.
Oh, right. Yeah. Extra room, extra girth to get through. That's so funny. So growing up, did you have a favorite animal? Were you always into wolves, or was that sort of something that materialized through school and life? And
I'd say materialized through school and life. I mean, so I recently finished grad school officially in March. And what I did in grad school I didn't study wolves. So my background, like my undergrad, I studied animal welfare or applied animal biology, but there's a heavy focus on animal welfare. So that focused a lot on animals in captivity, farm animals. And, you know, thankfully I had a really great professor in that program that did a lot of wildlife research. So I've always had an interest in wild animals or wildlife, but to be honest, going into it, I went into it because I saw shows of like, you know, zookeepers taking care of wild animals, having this like really intimate relationship with them. And I was like, that's so cool. And so my biology teacher, she was a zoologist. She's like, okay, you want to work with animals in captivity? I would recommend looking at this program. And then when I was in the program...
What was the program?
So it's the Land and Food Systems program at UBC. And there's a few different streams, but this was the applied animal biology stream.
Cool.
And I soon learned what is, you know, what entails being held captive and how it's, you know, not a great situation for many animals. And that kind of taught me a lot. It definitely shifted my views and kind of my feelings of responsibility towards wildlife. And, you know, I think a lot of what people do in working with animals in captivity is really important. But at the same time, I really wanted to focus my efforts on wild animals and how like welfare relates to conservation as well. And that's kind of where I kind of figured out or learned a lot about, you know, conservation biology, animal welfare, and how historically they've kind of diverged in a sense, and there hasn't been, you know, acceptance of like the overlap and how animal welfare really does impact wild populations. And so I wanted to do something that kind of bridges the two. And my grad research, I had the opportunity to go to Thailand and study a population of rewilded Asian elephants, and kind of taking that conservation approach or that animal welfare approach to conservation. So yeah, not to do with wolves, but I mean, being in grad school, I was in this kind of more unique situation where I was studying elephants, but I was in the Canid Conservation Science Lab at the University of Calgary. So my supervisor, her expertise is on coyotes and wolves. And a lot of my lab mates were studying coyotes and had experience and a lot of information about wolves. So I learned kind of that in the background and found it fascinating because coyotes and wolves, they're fascinating beings, but they're also, have endured so much persecution and continue to endure so much persecution.
They're so demonized.
Yeah. Yeah. So I looked, I was looking for an internship during grad school, and my supervisor has a good relationship with Dr. Podchat, who is our large carnivore expert at Raincoast. And she's like, Raincoast is great. Like, they're one of the few conservation organizations that considers conservation ethics and animal welfare. And so that kind of led me to approaching them, and I interned with them it was just really good timing. Like, they've always done wolf work and large carnivore work, but we've never had a coordinator for the program. It's always kind of been off the side of the desk with like Paul's work, with Chris Daramont's work, just what we do generally on large carnivores. So there's never been kind of like a fully developed program. So I kind of came in as an intern trying to work to develop that program.
And so what is your role now?
So I'm the Wolf Conservation Program Coordinator.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It's a pretty cool title.
Yeah.
So I just want to go back to something you said there. So you're talking about working with animal welfare in conservation. Like, what do you mean by that? Is that like, if you're going to conserve a population of whatever species, you're kind of looking at like, well, like, is this population worth conserving in the state? Like, are they going to be living happy, healthy lives? Or is it like just keeping them alive for the sake of keeping them alive type thing? Like,
I think there's so many different ways you can kind of merge the two or consider both. For example, in research, a lot of our methods, if we take wolves, for example, can have a huge negative impact on the welfare of the animals. So wolves, a lot of methods that are still used require like live tracking, trapping, and GPS collaring of wolves. But there's been a lot of progression in research methods like camera traps, acoustic recorders, scat analysis, where there are some research questions that cannot be answered without collaring a wolf. But, there's a ton of stuff that we can find out about wolves just through their scat, understanding their genetics, their diet.
And acoustic ecology is a huge kind of booming field right now. That's really cool.
Yeah, and we're kind of getting into that with, our cetacean research, but also our wolf research. And there's, emerging research that has studied the howls of wolves and their distinct howls and how you can actually identify individuals because each howl is so unique to that individual.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. So like measuring abundance, you could, pair camera traps and acoustic recorders and kind of merge the two to, look for unique markings like facial markings or body markings, and then also have that pair of the acoustic recorders to kind of look for howls and if you can capture them. Yeah,
that's awesome. Okay, so it's more about like, how do you conduct conservation methods in a way that's good for the animals, not necessarily like whether or not you conserve based on what's good for the animals.
Yeah, so that's kind of the research component, but then also like,
I was just trying to clarify to fully understand what it is that you, like the realm that you're working in. Yeah,
so that would be one component, but also for example, with the research that we did with the elephants, like we really wanted to understand, we wanted to kind of explore this new way of thinking of conservation because Asian elephants, for example, in Thailand, captive elephants and wild elephants have a completely different legal designation. The wild population is endangered and the captive population is considered legally a domestic animal. So they can be traded and sold for large sums of money, but they are the same species. They've never been domesticated. They've been used by humans for thousands of years, but they've never been domesticated for multiple reasons. And so we were trying to kind of show that, you can take these elephants that were previously captive, give them an opportunity to live in their natural habitat, and they can, we can restore their ecological function in that that ecosystem, but also from the elephant's perspective, like we can give them that opportunity to live that life and look at like their well-being as an individual, because individuals make up populations. And when we're looking at population health, it needs to be recognized that it's not just the numbers and their ecological or their ecosystem services, which I don't really like that term, but to keep it at a minimum just so that population can function in that ecosystem, we need to consider that like this population is made up of individuals. And so when we're making conservation choices like predator management and mass killings of predators, like we can't just look at them as a number. We need to consider the welfare of the individuals.
Totally. And for future generations too, because when you get like such a small population, you have dwindling genetic diversity within that pool, because you're essentially getting like a bottleneck when you have, a limited number of like wild animals. So you need to like be able to interject some different genetics into there so that they can maintain their health into the future. So it's like looking out for the future generations of that.
Yeah.
Does that distinction between domesticated and like endangered, does that put a lot of pressure on like poaching the endangered species to be domesticated? Like, is it a big market to sell an elephant?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That's so because it's so hard to breed elephants in captivity, that boosts the kind of drive to poach them from the wild. So that's a huge threat to wild populations, is the live capture and trade.
So it's almost like the industry of buying and selling domesticated elephants is causing the destruction of the wild endangered populations.
Yeah. And there's more captive Asian elephants than wild ones in Thailand.
I didn't realize it was so difficult to breed elephants in captivity.
Yeah, I mean,
to be honest, I don't know a ton about elephants. If I had to like map where my shortcomings and fun facts come into, it's probably in the elephant range.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun facts about elephants, but I mean, their gestation period is like 22 months. There's a lot that goes into...
That is so long.
Yeah.
That's almost 2 years.
I know. So like
wow.
The stress, I think a lot of it has to do with the stress of captivity. Like there are some species that, if in captivity, they could be, their range is quite small. You could kind of mimic their natural environment, but for an elephant, that is absolutely impossible. Like their range is so vast. And what they require, even not just ecologically, but also, and their food and stuff, like to be able to replicate and that's what we kind of studied too, is all these complex foraging behaviors that have benefits to their well-being as well, because they've evolved to kind of forage these really complex different plant species and breaking them down and selecting for particular parts of that plant, likely based on nutrients. And so that's so hard to replicate in captivity, of like, there's so much literature about how to get their diet right. But then, so all that stress adds to like being in captivity and not being in a normal social unit. And that stress can really affect breeding, and then even just the gestation. And then if breeding's successful, it's quite common that mothers will kill their infants. Like it's a problem as well. Just like I don't know if we really know why, but it's just something that we don't really see in the wild, but we see in captivity.
Well, and even if we did know why, quote unquote, in our human terms, it's different. Like knowing why is different than understanding it, And I think elephants are a great example of that. Like elephants, like wolves, like they're very complex, very cognitive, like creatures. Like they're incredibly social, they're incredibly smart. Like their senses and ability to sense things is so far beyond ours. Like how are we ever going to be able to get to a point where we can like understand how they feel? It's like, sure, we can know how they act and under certain circumstances, or what behavior is caused by what stimulus, but like to really know and understand a thing, like we're so different. I think it's arrogant of humans to think that we ever will understand what goes on in an elephant's mind or a wolf's mind.
Yeah. And just to add to that, because that just makes me think of just kind of how we think about research too, is like we're always trying to, compare these animals to us. And like there is, a lot more sometimes.
Aren't you not supposed to do that? Isn't that anthropomorphizing? Aren't you not supposed to say that they're like humans? They're different. And humans are separate than animals.
Yeah. And it's like, we just need to try and understand, like, what does it mean to be an elephant? What does it mean to be a wolf? Not how is a wolf like a human, or how is an elephant like a human? Because they're their own species, and we can't place value on an animal because they're more like us, which is what we do.
Exactly.
Unfortunately.
Place our value set on other things than, because, of course, we're at the top, humans.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's sarcasm for those of you who can't pick up on that. Actually, I did have one interesting fun fact about elephants that came to mind. Their ability, I think it's smell. I'm assuming it's smell. They have like a heightened sense of smell, and I don't know if the study was trying to get them to eat kelp as like a food source or something, just like a farmed food source. But like when they're faced with, or when they have like a piece of bull kelp, for example, the thing in the bulb that makes the bull kelp rise is carbon monoxide. And it's like such trace amounts, we could have never smelled, but they're able to. So when they find like bull kelp, the first thing they do is crush all those bulbs to release the carbon monoxide so they don't ingest it.
That's so cool. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, because their smell is like not even just for food, but even just socializing and getting to know individuals, related individuals, identifying who's friend or foe, like all of that relies a lot on smell.
God, I know we're supposed to be talking about wolves, but now I'm so curious about elephants. Because you think about that trunk, like how many bristles and sensory bits are all up along the trunk of that, like... That's crazy. Anyway, wolves are fascinating too. Wolves also have a great sense of smell.
Yeah, and wolves, there's a lot to kind of compare to. I mean, they're obviously very different species, but they're both very socially complex.
Very familial.
Yeah, and like can create these like complex, intimate bonds with one another. And it creates this really complex social structure where you see a lot of cooperation. Like with wolves, you see cooperative hunting. And that's what kind of really makes them really cool in my eyes, as well as like they're very expressive. So, I mean, when we talk about even like hierarchy within wolf packs, like people might think, that I want to avoid using alpha because I was just having a discussion with Podchat about this and how, there are like these kind of terms that we use like alpha, omega, beta, to describe the hierarchy. But he was saying like, I don't like to use those terms specifically because it creates this rigid structure that doesn't account for the fluidity and the variability that you see in packs.
Complexity within any social network.
Yeah. And the fact that like it can change. It can change depending on the season over time, and like just the environment. Like packs can be so different and variable depending on a lot of factors and composition of the pack, like age or sex.
Sorry, I had a brief question. Like, like with elephants, they're mostly matriarchal, like family structures. Is that the same with wolves, or is it mostly male dominated?
I say it's pretty equivalent in the sense like that you would have.
So there's an alpha female, alpha male. From my understanding, like wolf packs are pretty like it's a nuclear family where it's like a mother, father wolf and like their offspring for the most part.
Yeah, for the most part. And that can vary a lot. Like there can on occasions be more than one breeding pair. There could be like some researchers have seen like one male with multiple females that are breeding. But I think typically like overall, generally it's one breeding pair. And, the size of the pack can really vary, especially on prey abundance. And wolves are, they regulate for that kind of relationship to prey as well. But I think their social dynamics are super interesting, and the way that they communicate within their packs and express through body language and vocalization, but like a lot of body language, just even like a simple stare from like a dominant wolf to a submissive wolf, and, tail position, lip position, ear position, body posture, like all these things are like these signals of how they communicate, which I think is really cool. And like, we can't just say, it really depends on context as well. Like a lot of those behaviors we'll see within play behaviors, within, a lot of submissive behaviors you can see like in fearful behaviors as well. So it's interesting learning about, even I think when hopefully I have a dog in the near future, it's like these kind of like behaviors. Of course, there's a lot of differences between dogs and wolves, but just understanding, I think it would be really cool to just like understand through body language, because there's so many things that we think of like, oh, like if I like anthropomorphizing, like if I'm yawning, oh, I'm tired. But like a dog, for example, is like, that's a stress response. And it's like just understanding those different animal behaviors and cues to like just better relate to your animal when you can't speak the same language. I think is cool.
That's what I mean. And not just compare dogs to wolves, because I know they're totally different, but that's one of the things that I love the most about dogs is just how emotive they are. Like, and wolves, like they express a lot, but they're also so capable of reading other emotions, and not just within wolves. Like, you know, like your dog can sense when you're sad or angry or mad or whatever. Like it knows through subtle motions of body language or things that you would never ever like really realize that you're expressing yourself. Like they can pick up on that. I think that's really cool. I wish humans were more like that sometimes.
I know, right?
Like so many people are just like so emotionally brain dead.
Yeah.
You're just like how do you not understand the feelings happening right now, the emotion? But dogs are great. So I guess like I know I sent you a list of questions, but before we jump into all that, I'm going to go totally rogue here. And just like, tell me about wolves. Like, let's just start at the top. What makes wolves so cool and fascinating?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, their expressiveness and their social structures, I think, are really cool. So I don't want to repeat that, but that's one of the things that I love about them. I think like the diversity of like within the species is really interesting too. And like, I mean, you can have wolves up in the north that are like, you know, above 100 pounds, like they're these big wolves. And then you have the coastal wolves that are, you know, a lot smaller, but also have like these very diverse and different diets. And I mean, coastal wolves are so cool because we think of, you know, wolves as having like the majority of their diet is these ungulate species like deer and elk and moose. And then you see these coastal wolves that kind of have this completely different kind of inhabit this different ecosystem where they fish for salmon and they forage on whale carcasses.
Do they fish for salmon?
Yeah.
I haven't seen that. That's crazy. I know that like up to 90% of their diet can be marine derived.
Yeah. So a lot of that would be salmon. And a cool thing about that too is that, you know, if you see a salmon that's being brought into the forest, likely by a predator, and it's headless, it's likely being a wolf that has caught that salmon and just eaten the brain or the head. And
really?
Yeah. And
I always thought that was bears.
So bears will also target the head, but they'll sometimes eat, you know, the skin and the eggs. They're targeting the most fatty places. But with wolves, they avoid...
It's just the most nutritious.
Well, we think that they avoid the body to avoid like things like tapeworm and salmon poisoning, which is like a bacterial kind of thing that congregates in the muscles and the kidneys of the fish, and it can be fatal to canids, so dogs and wolves and coyotes. So yeah, so it's an interesting thing that they avoid because they, you know, have evolved to know that it's dangerous to them.
Or maybe not evolved to know, but maybe that's like wisdom passed down from elders.
Yeah, exactly.
So along with that, like shift in diet or differences in diet between populations come different hunting tactics and social patterns. Like, I think the craziest thing to me about wolves is the fact that it's all Canis lupus all across Europe and Asia, and same with North America. Like that's as far as like species goes, that's a really successful species to take over that wide of an area, and like basically they inhabit the whole northern hemisphere. That's pretty cool. And then there's all these like subspecies of it, so every population's different. I mean, if you include what's the subspecies for dogs? It's like Canis lupus familiaris or something. Familiaris, something like that. Like I would argue that makes dogs probably one of the most successful species on the planet. Like they're everywhere. That's pretty cool. Yeah,
and it's I mean, given the persecution that they've faced and how they've been extirpated from many regions and still face, I mean, that the fact that they can inhabit, I mean, historically they inhabited most land in the northern hemisphere. And now they're, you know, returning, but like in the US, for example, they inhabit like 5% of what they used to. And they've been extirpated from many regions. And I mean, in BC, in parts of the Kootenays, Thompson region, Vancouver Island in the 70s, they were extirpated, but they're resilient. They're at a population level, they're extremely resilient, but the persecution that they face still affects them as individuals. And, there's been studies, Heather Bryant, one of our kind of Raincoast colleagues, did a really cool study on just the stress response of like looking at scat analysis and looking at levels of stress hormones in scat of wolves in regions that were heavily hunted and then regions that didn't have much hunting activity.
Wow. And you can detect that in the scat.
Yeah, and found that there was just, a major increase in stress hormones. And so we think of, it's like hunting doesn't just involve killing the animal. It can also have an impact on their stress responses and their well-being because of that.
And that's so traumatic. Like if you think about that, then even being like a wolf pup growing up in that situation, like you hold on to this like generational trauma from your parents that have been living in a world where they've been hunted and extirpated like that across like massive swaths of land.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's tragic.
Yeah.
I mean, especially like I have a dog, so when you say a lot of these things, I like think back to Pincho and I'm like referencing him. But like just seeing him interact with other dogs at like the dog park, and like the way if like something negative happens or someone like gets angry, like the way, again, like being an emotive creature, like he like takes that and like holds on to it. And like if you can imagine being a family pack out in the wild and knowing that there's this thing coming specifically to hunt you and watching family members die and get shot like randomly, like that would be so traumatic.
Yeah.
That's crazy that they can measure the levels of stress hormones in scat.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you more about it. It's not my expertise, but I'm hoping like as our research progresses, like there's so much you can do with scat. So
yeah,
maybe we can talk in the future and I can tell you more details.
have a little scat chat.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are all gray wolves covered in North America, and that's the only species of wolf that really exists, right? There's red wolves.
There's the red wolf as well.
Aren't red wolves, is that a separate species, or are those are kind of like mules, right? They're crosses between coyote and wolf?
I think there's some debate about that. I can't speak too much about that, but I know that they're critically endangered. There's this one kind of population that lives in the eastern regions of the States. And then there's also like the eastern wolf that lives on the east coast or eastern region of Canada, that there's some debate of whether
it's a separate species.
It's a separate species.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think, the subspecies is there's a lot of conversations within the academic community about how wolves should be categorized subspecies wise, like even with coastal wolves, up until like Alaska and coastal BC, researchers believe that they should be given kind of the separate subspecies or ecotype that requires like a different kind of conservation status as well, because they're so unique.
Right, and a different body type. It's not like you could take one of those 100-pound wolves up north that you were talking about, pluck them on the coast, and they would do just fine, So there's this idea of like the lone wolf. Tell me about a lone wolf. Why do lone wolves exist?
I mean, lone wolves, I think it's like maybe 5 or 10% of the population at a time could be a lone wolf, but a lone wolf that lives his or her entire life alone is not typical. Lone wolves usually result from, as the pack grows and wolves get older, and depending on, the ecosystem that they're inhabiting, and if they need to go off and find a mate and start their own pack, that's kind of where you see the lone wolf, is this like leaving of the pack and searching for a mate. There have been cases of lone wolves like Stakea, this kind of iconic lone wolf that was known on Discovery in the Chatham Islands in kind of the Songhees Nations territories. And he, was a lone wolf that was well known by the community and kind of comparable to the kind of like Cecil the lion story in a way. Like the community knew the wolf very well and, coexisted, lived alongside respectfully with this wolf. And I don't know if it was 2019, He left the islands and traveled into kind of the greater Victoria area, and was spotted within the community, and conservation officers were alerted, and they moved him, I think, to Port Renfrew. And I think he was maybe, I don't know if he had a GPS collar, but they were able to follow, which makes me believe that he probably was collared. They were able to kind of track him in his journey, essentially what looked like he was returning back to his home. And during that time, he was hunted and shot by a hunter and killed. So that kind of brought a lot of attention to the fact that it is legal to kill a wolf. That's not necessarily having any negative interaction with humans. It's just completely legal. There's an open season, essentially. I mean, across BC, for hunting, there's an open season from 9 months out of the year. So they essentially just really have a couple months in the summer where they're free from that type of persecution, but not really, because, wolf poaching is very prevalent as well.
And why just during those months? Is that like pup rearing months kind of thing?
It's not. It might be kind of an attempt to give them some relief when pups are growing up and in the summer when they become more mobile, but pupping season is in April.
So it's just kind of like an arbitrary time of year that they were like, oh, let's shut down these 3 months. It's too hot to hunt. Yeah.
And it's legal to shoot pups and a breeding female in the den. Like, There's no laws against that. And, the regulations are extremely lenient for wolves. So there's that long 9-month period. But there's also, that's not the case for every region. So if there's, livestock depredation issues, or if there is, if we're talking about regions in caribou habitat, there's no close season, no bag limit, meaning bag limit is how many wolves a hunter can kill in a year. So the number is unlimited in those regions. There's also no specific species tag. So there's no real way to monitor how many wolves are actually being killed. So like the number that the government gave in, I think, 2015 in their wolf management plan was about 1,200 wolves is kind of the estimate of wolves that are killed through like control purposes and hunting and trapping, or the 1,200 was specifically hunters. And that number comes from these surveys that the government does. And in the management plan, they even admit that it's, not super reliable. And I mean, Dr. Podchat would say that it's likely, the number is likely a lot higher, because there's only mandatory or compulsory reporting required if a wolf is shot on the island or the mainland. So any of those other regions, like there's...
Like the lower mainland, do you mean?
The lower mainland, yeah.
That seems reckless. Like, that seems like a blatant disregard or lack of care for the animal in general. It's like even with fish, you're so scrutinized with how many fish you catch, how big they were. But like with a wolf, you don't have to record whether or not it was shot, where it was, or anything. Like, you can legally go in and shoot a mother wolf and all her cubs. And that's just like, and you don't even have to record it.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
So how did we get to this point? Why have wolves been demonized so heavily?
Yeah, I mean, with colonization, we brought agriculture, and agriculture is kind of what stemmed this conflict between wolves and livestock and farmers and ranchers, and this competition between wolves and humans to protect livestock, and also with prized game species as well. Hunters are interested in the elk, the moose, the deer, and so are wolves. So that kind of, like, with colonization, kind of brought these agricultural practices and this kind of human wolf conflict, and that also brought bounties. So in bounty programs were implemented. So it's essentially like, we're going to put a price tag on a wolf.
Mm-hmm. It's like 2 shillings per pelt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that just like really instilled a lot of hatred towards wolves. And because people hate wolves, it has ultimately led to like government policies that have led to like having the goal of extirpating wolves from certain regions. And that's exactly what we did in certain regions, like I mentioned before, like on Vancouver Island in the 1970s, in different parts like the Kootenays and the Thompson region. And so there's been this kind of constant war on wolves. And also, in addition to that, like their habitat is being destroyed, and that can have effects on their prey, like prey abundance and distribution. And then also there's, like we know we're learning more about wolves, but there's still so much more to learn. So there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that can really create fear for some people. And just the misinformation that's even seen in childhood stories, like the big bad wolf and Red Riding Hood.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing too. Like you mentioned colonization coming over with agriculture and that kind of being the spur of it. But like I would say that even before that, those colonists came over from Europe where wolves had been extirpated like around there for those same reasons. So they already came over with this preconceived notion in their head that wolves were bad and the enemy, like. And when conveyed like that, like they can be terrifying. Like I remember I had like, there was this book I had when I was a kid. It was like a bunch of horror stories. And there was one about this like gray wolf, and like the sketch of it was like this black and white, like ghosty wolf face. And it was terrifying. Like it haunted me. And I had like a nightmare like years ago. I want to say it was close to a decade ago that involved like a wolf coming like out of the darkness. And like, I still like think of that and it gives me chills, but like, that's all been things that have been like fabricated by like the world that we live in, like telling me those like horror stories, which is a shame because it's not giving us a chance to like see this animal as it is.
Yeah. And it even like, I see it when like I'm in the field doing research, and to be honest, I'm very like new to this, and I haven't spent a lot of time in areas that I know there's wolves alone. And a lot of the research that we've done so far, like I always have like a couple people with me. So I've probably only spent like an hour in the forest by myself, unable to find the trailhead, and just ended up bushwhacking. And it's like, I experience that fear, but I'm like, I know all this stuff about wolves and how, like, the chances of a negative encounter happening is so slim. And like just being aware, like, okay, I'm not entering into, like, it's not pupping or denning season. So I don't have to worry about them being extra like cautious and territorial and protective. And even like Dr. Paul Paquette tells me, like, when if you're going out in the forest, if you see a wolf, if you happen to see a wolf in front of you, likely there's another one behind you, because that's kind of what we see. They kind of like circle around you to kind of check you out. And like the way he talks about it is like, it's like, it's not, I mean, the only reason that maybe we should be fearful of wolves in a situation like that is if we're in a region that we know that these wolves have been not habituated, but conditioned. Like habituation and conditioning are quite different in terms of, if a wolf or an animal is habituated, that kind of just means that they've lost their wariness of humans. And, habituation can lead to peaceful coexistence, but unfortunately it often leads to conditioning, meaning that there's a reward that is received from a wolf when they associate humans or see a human, like food conditioning essentially. So if a wolf starts to associate humans with food, that's where they can, more so approach humans and like expect that reward. And that's where, like, of course there's been, humans that have been super irresponsible. I think like there's a lot of, examples in on the West Coast in the Euclid and Tofino region, and even Vargas Island, where like there have been people that have seen humans hand feeding wolves, like pieces of whale carcass. And I mean, that's a lot of what stemmed out from like the Wild About Wolves program over there.
I haven't heard of that.
There's on Vargas Island, there were 2 wolves that ended up having to be killed because of their interactions with humans.
They're getting too comfortable and coming too close to people, just expecting to be hand-fed?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because they were hand-fed, and then it resulted in a negative interaction.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and it makes me think a lot about like that kind of relationship, what I talked about before when I was younger, where I saw this like really intimate relationship between humans and animals in captivity. And it's like, I think a lot of people sometimes they see that and they hear stories about these really intimate encounters with wildlife, and they want that. And it's a really selfish way to think about things.
Yeah,
because,
it's like glamorizing it.
Yeah, and because ultimately, like, you're likely not gonna suffer any repercussions, but that animal is likely gonna end up dead.
Mm-hmm. Everybody wants to be Tarzan.
Yeah.
Dr. Dolittle speaking to the animals. Mm-hmm. And it's a shame because like so much of like, even when you're talking about the wolves circling to like get a better understanding, I immediately think like raptors in Jurassic Park, like circling to hunt. And it's like, but it's not like that. I think of like wolves, like wolf attacks on humans are incredibly rare. And I think I heard something somewhere, I don't know if it's fact, but like apparently there's never been any recorded history of like a wolf just attacking a human standing. It's always been like when a person's like injured or they're like starving, it's like it's someone like on the ground. Yeah. It's like if you're standing, a wolf's not going to come near you. Like
Yeah, I mean, I can't confirm that, but
that was something I heard.
Sounds
not necessarily
right.
fact, but
yeah, and like even with like coyotes, for example, we experience a lot of like human conflict or negative interactions, I guess, with coyotes because they're in urban settings a lot, and every single incident can be traced back to not hand feeding, but feeding in terms of could be hand feeding, could be leaving garbage out. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's unfortunate.
Coyotes are more frequently in urban settings. Is that just because they're a little bit more, I was going to say wily, a little more wily, a little sneaky, wily coyote, versus like a wolf? Yeah, I mean, I know there's like habitat fragmentation and like disconnection between that. So like they're like living in different areas, but like you don't frequently see wolves kind of like roaming through a neighborhood looking for trash and stuff.
Yeah, coyotes are just very adaptable, and you can see like in kind of more of those rural wild spaces, coyotes can, depending on the ecosystem and if there's wolves present, can create these kind of larger packs of, multiple individuals, not talking about 20s of coyotes, but
thousands. Thousands of coyotes descending from the hills.
Yeah.
On the North Vancouver, just taking everybody's kittens.
Yeah. But then in urban settings, they're just a lot more adaptable. And that's also because, we have like a healthy food population or prey population for them in urban settings too, like rodents and small mammals. And yeah, wolves just aren't necessarily like I don't know if I can give you a good reason of why you don't see them in urban settings, but they are very wary of humans. And I mean, and that can vary obviously because we're talking about individual wolves with different curiosities and different personalities, and some of them can be habituated to humans a lot more easily, and some are just a lot more cautious, and that could also be a result of life history too.
And for the most part, wolf packs are families, so you're trying to find a big enough prey or a cache of food to feed a family. Like a couple rats here and there isn't really going to get you far. Yeah. So I guess all that brings us to, what is the current state of wolves in BC, and what's the kind of work or research that you're working on?
In terms of, I don't want to focus too much on population numbers, but, there are like a wide-ranging estimate of wolves, and they do occupy about 80% of their former range in BC. The current state of wolves, as I've kind of touched on, is, their major threats are habitat destruction and human tolerance, in the sense of, how they're persecuted in terms of hunting practices, government sanctioned wolf kills, and just for livestock protection as well.
Is that still like a big part of it? Like, I mean, like I know a lot of it is like that kind of social element of like people just like generationally having stories about wolves being evil, so like wanting to continue to kill them. But like are wolves still going out after livestock? Is that still like the biggest thing? Like, are farmers still just like, we got to kill the wolves to protect my sheep? That's still like a big thing.
I think it varies a lot, and I think those like concerns by livestock owners and ranchers are definitely something that need to be acknowledged. And it can be, difficult to lose livestock to wolves, and it does happen, but there's so much research and techniques that have been tested and proved to work that are non-lethal techniques of coexisting, like livestock guardian dogs or range riders. And there's a lot of good like case studies done in the US and in Alberta where there are these ranchers that are coexisting with wolves, in the sense that it's not that wolves moved out of the area, it's that wolves live on the land, and they know this through like monitoring through acoustic recorders or camera traps. And it's through these different techniques. Like, I was listening to this really great webinar recently where they essentially created these collars that have these flashing lights on the back that the livestock guardian dogs wear. And even just that, and they were talking about this encounter, this that one of the ranchers experienced, where I think they heard the dog barking, and they went to, and they observed this kind of encounter between the livestock guardian dog and the wolf. And the wolf, or the dog, was barking at the wolf and took a step towards the wolf, and the wolf stepped back, which is not normally how it would happen. A wolf would likely engage and there would be some kind of altercation. And then the dog took a couple more steps and the wolf took off. And they were like, we've never seen that ever. And like this flashing light, I think, just has some kind of impact where it just kind of throws them off, I guess. And they have that not just on dogs, but I think throughout the land, where there's like random noise or random lights that happen that kind of mimic human presence, because human presence is the best way to deter wolves from going for your livestock.
And they run off.
Yeah. So there's all these kind of different non-lethal methods that mimic human presence when humans can't be around. And they found a lot of success with it.
So it's kind of like the modern day scarecrow.
Yeah.
That's cool. What kind of dogs did they train to be the guardian dogs? Are those like wolf-like dogs, or do they have...
I can't tell you exactly like all the breeds. Actually, on this webinar, someone asked a similar question, and it was kind of based on dogs that have worked historically, and, sometimes specific breeds that are often used, like, again, like depending on the individual dog, aren't really cut out for that work. So it kind of is whatever works. You're not going to have a Chihuahua barking up a wolf. Okay, fair enough. Wouldn't last very long.
So here in BC, a lot of the discussion that I hear around wolves is revolving around caribou, because mountain caribou are an endangered species, specifically in the interior of the province. But historically, they're not like a prey that wolves would be going for.
They're part of the diet of some wolves, not all. It just kind of depends on the ecosystem.
They're not the main prey that they would be going for.
Yeah, I think in BC, in those populations that we see, like, it's often moose and deer that these wolves are going for. But because of the way that we've altered,
and elk too, right?
And elk,
right.
Yeah. And elk will often kind of, if elk are present in an ecosystem, they're often the primary prey of wolves in comparison to, say, deer, just based on, the energetic balance of kind of going for like a faster deer that's smaller. It makes a lot more sense energetically to go for a larger elk that kind of reaps more reward.
And especially because elk traditionally habitate in lower areas, like lowland areas, along rivers, more flatter land, easier terrain to navigate. But so how are wolves getting at these caribou populations, and why is this a big deal?
Yeah, so essentially, like, wolves will exploit any kind of man-made road, trail, snowmobile path that humans create. It just makes it a lot easier for them to travel. And as you know, with kind of intensive logging practices, there's roads and pathways that are made to kind of get that equipment out there. And that creates this easier access to caribou. So historically, like, caribou require these old growth forests for protection from predators as well as for their main food sources. And now that we've kind of fragmented their habitat and created these roads, we've created easier access to wolves. And it might not be that they're, going for the caribou, but it could be that, they're hunting deer, moose, and they just stumble across like a caribou is just there at the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing the road, and runs into a wolf. And it just creates there's just a lot more easy access for wolves to kind of stumble across those caribou and prey upon them. And the fact that they're losing so much habitat is what has led to them being at the status they are now, which is critically endangered for the mountain caribou and burial caribou.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like where wolves would normally hunt kind of in the lowland areas over like bigger animals like elk, deer up into the hillsides and everything, now these roadways are getting them access to like high alpine areas where the caribou exist, like in this old growth forest, feeding off the lichen. Because we have so little logging left on these lower areas, we're now having to move up into these alpine areas to get the last of this old growth for demand for logging, and it's creating these pathways that the wolves are using to hunt the caribou. And now BC's home to like one of the largest wolf culls as an attempt to like keep the numbers of wolves down so that the caribou can bounce back theoretically. What's your opinion on that whole approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not great. Wolves are essentially being scapegoated for what we have done in terms of destroying old growth habitat and through these industrial logging practices. And, there's many reasons why the culling of the mass killing of predators just isn't, a great way a great method of conservation. I mean, it's a way for the government to look like they're doing something about this, when in reality, like, we're still allowing logging of old growth habitats and forests, and
which is what's reducing the caribou habitat while also creating pathways for wolves to get to caribou.
Yeah. And like the idea is that they are removing, 80 to 90% of wolves within caribou habitat. And I think back to one of your interviews with Dr. Rachel Holt saying that, like, ecosystems are like, they're so unique. So you can't necessarily apply what you find in one region to everywhere. Like, they function differently, and a lot of ecosystems function differently because of what we've kind of done to alter them as well. But it's like there are, the research on this is at best ambiguous, in the sense that, there's recent research that shows, like, coupled with maternal penning, the hunting or the culling of predators, we're seeing like a slight increase. But that's not surprising to see. When you remove a predator, to see a slight increase in the prey population is, that makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot more to consider in that whole picture, because also when we're removing a predator, like, these wolves have a disproportionate influence on the ecosystem, and we see ecosystems without wolves suffering from ecological impoverishment, and it can have a detrimental effect, like we saw in Yellowstone, where it's just it's not just their direct impact on prey by eating them, it's the kind of landscape of fear that they create for these prey species, making them more vigilant and not overgrazing in certain areas, allowing for more tree growth, and which creates, more habitat for bird species and shade for rivers and streams, that creates better viable habitat for salmon and other aquatic species. And so there's all these indirect impacts. And through the 7 or so years that we've been culling wolves, there hasn't been an ecological impact assessment on like what the impact is actually on like removing these predators, because we can't just consider that one predator prey interaction in like a potentially multi predator prey system. And like to also mention, it's not just wolves that are being killed in this program. It's also moose and deer. The idea is to limit competition between prey species and limit the number of prey in that system that wolves are going for. So we're calling wolves and moose and deer.
I didn't realize that moose and deer were part of that. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. But the moose and deer aren't even going for like the same feed as the caribou. It's just to reduce.
The idea is to reduce, essentially, like in a functioning ecosystem, if it was just a single predator, single prey, you had a wolf and a caribou, and the caribou are just dwindling to these very low numbers. Wolves are going to adapt for that. They're not going to just kill caribou to extinction. They're going to adapt their populations, and we'd see like a decrease in their numbers likely, or like the pack parts, individuals from the pack would move out and you'd see smaller packs. But when there's also healthy populations of moose and deer and other prey for wolves, that's where you don't see a change in the wolf population. So that's kind of the idea behind that. But it's like, it brings up the conversation of, killing one species for another, and that brings in a lot of conversations around like conservation ethics and environmental ethics and what our moral imperatives are to wildlife. And it brings in a lot of ethical dilemmas and moral confusion for a lot of people. And and I mean, beyond like just using predator control as a method for conservation, killing for conservation, like the methods that are used when we bring it back to like welfare and humaneness are terrible as well. So when we just look at that, these wolves, it's, 200 to 300 wolves that are removed or killed every year. That number can fluctuate. I think in 2019, it was like 483 wolves were killed, and they're killed via like low flying aircraft, so helicopters. And
they're just sniped, basically.
And when you think about even the most skilled marksmen shooting a wolf from a moving target, so shooting a moving target from a moving platform, like it's near impossible to actually shoot a wolf in, say, a vital organ that would be deemed kind of a humane death, like the head or the heart or the lungs. It's very difficult. So to say that that's a humane method, I mean, on their website, they kind of say they do use the word humane, but it's, in the past, the government has admitted that like there is no humane way to kill, like to kill this large number of wolves. But it's better, for example, than maybe trapping large numbers of wolves, because with trapping, and this is still happens in Alberta, they would use poisons like strychnine poisoning. So essentially they'd create these traps and they would bait them. So they would have like a trap in the middle with strychnine poisoning in the prey. And then they'd also have, all these little bait stations around. And this would be based on like kind of how feeding happens often with wolves is like the breeding, more dominant pair would feed first. And then the more subordinates would kind of hang out around the exterior of the circle. And so they've like would create like these like poisoned bait stations around that kind of main prey source, essentially trying to poison the entire pack. And in addition to that, strychnine poisoning resulting in a just torturous, inhumane death for those wolves, it also can poison other prey species that are scavenging on those prey, like birds of prey, owls, wolverines, bears, caribou in some cases. In Alberta, one of the studies was talking about all of the secondary deaths caused by strychnine poisoning, and caribou were in that list. There's
How does
two
that
caribou.
even happen? Like,
just probably foraging like around that region, because it's also like you have this poisoned prey, but all these animals are kind of scavenging and probably bringing it to different locations, and it can spread out the poison.
It's like glyphosate. It's like, yeah, you spray it in one area, but it gets everywhere. And then before you know it, it's in our blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that doesn't happen BC prides themselves on not using those poisons anymore, but it still happens in Alberta. And the culls happen in BC and Alberta.
So, just to go back on your terminology, you called that trapping? That's called trapping? Where you poison it?
So they would be, I guess.
Because that's not trapping.
No,
that's just
not trapping.
Okay,
Sorry,
I was like,
guess,
that is so fucked up to like rebrand that as like, oh, we're just trapping these wolves, i.e. we're just like poisoning the shit out of the whole thing.
Yeah, I guess in terms, it's like, I don't know if they use a baited trap or it's just these like kind of areas that they are kind of infiltrating with these poisons in a systematic way.
I guess even if they were to like physically trap them in a cage, they'd still probably end up shooting them or something.
Yeah, and how they would trap them, it wouldn't be in a cage. So trapping is also
it'd be like a snare,
but it would be like leg hold traps, neck snares, which can also result in a really inhumane death, because even like the kill snares that are designed to have like a really instant death, that doesn't necessarily happen all the time. And leg hold traps, like a lot of these animals will do anything that they can to try and escape, which can result in a really terrible death.
Like chew their arm off and stuff.
Yeah.
And then if that happens, like it's just one wolf in a pack, a family pack, it'd be like going out in the woods and your brother getting his foot trapped in something and screaming for help, and you can't do anything. Like that's traumatic for the rest of the pack. And then they grow up fearful and have like all sorts of different emotional baggage. I keep finding myself going back to this like emotional trauma thing with these wolves, these poor wolves.
And in most cases, the idea would be to take out the entire pack. And when the kill program kind of started in 2015, there was a lot of stuff that came out about the process of tracking these wolves. And they called the process using this Judas wolf, where essentially they would track and trap and GPS collar.
God, it's always got to come back to Christianity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They track and collar one single wolf?
Yeah, so they collar this one wolf and essentially then track that wolf and its return to the pack. So that wolf would essentially betray their location like Judas did. And then they would kill the entire pack and often still leave that Judas wolf alive and wait for that wolf to find another pack. And so you imagine the trauma that this one wolf is going through, watching his or her entire family be killed and then finding another pack and then going through the same thing. And, I'm not sure if they still do that, but that's kind of like the quickest method for them to find these wolves. And even if they take out the entire pack and there aren't individuals left to experience that trauma, wolves their populations are really resilient. And if there's prey in a certain area, like they're going to recolonize and repopulate in that region. So it just means that they're now going through this enduring cycle of suffering and death and then replenishment to just experience it all over again. And that's kind of what happens every year with these wolf culls. They're removed from the same region over and over again.
Yeah. And going back to like what you were saying about like every ecosystem being different, like a lot of the issues that I feel like we face when it comes to rehabilitating these ecosystems is that we've totally lost the baseline. So like we don't even know what population dynamics were like prior to Western colonization, prior to all this stuff. So when we're trying to like figure out like how to manage these ecosystems, it's like a lot of taking things you learned in one ecosystem and plugging it in and trying to like see if it works, but there's no way to like, you can't work backwards to figure out the dynamic, So it's a really difficult research situation to be in.
Yeah.
That, and like what you were saying about everything being interconnected, like I think it's so funny to think about that with caribou and wolves, because like caribou, like feed off lichen, which is like a small little fungi algae mix, like that lives in these old growth forests for protection. But then like wolf predation on that like changes the population dynamics of the caribou and all the different prey species, which, like you said, like referencing Yellowstone, like that's an amazing wolf reintroduction story in that it like literally changed the flow of the river, because there are all these impacts beyond just like carnivore eating an herbivore. Like a brief recap of the Yellowstone situation is when they reintroduced wolves, the elk that had been feeding in the lowland areas, because there weren't no wolves to drive them up, like they were eating all the saplings. The riverbanks were eroding. There wasn't like a lot of stable habitat. So as soon as the wolves got reintroduced, those elk spread more upwards into the valleys, which allowed the rivers to like rehabilitate, allowed the soils to stabilize on the riverbanks. You got all sorts of overhanging fish habitat and stuff. You got beavers coming back, so it like changes the shape of the river just by having the introduction of this one animal in there. I think it's just like, I guess going back to what I was saying after this like circular rant thing, is that I feel that the connection between caribou and lichen and wolf is just like a perfect epitome of like how interconnected these systems are, and we can't like just treat them as like Lego blocks where you like plug and play one different piece and it changes everything. Like everything is like so intricately balanced on everything else. It's nearly impossible to like fully know what you're doing when you take any sort of action. It's impossible to know what the impact of that is going to be like through all the different trickle down effects it could have. And
I think in the wolf caribou conversation too, it's like we need to think about what this habitat's going to look like in 50 to 100 years. Like, is an important question to ask of, is the mass killing of all these predators, these wolves, kind of is it worth the carnage when we don't really know, like, can we even get to a point that's going to, where the environment is going to favor caribou in that 50 to 100 years, just based on our trajectory with climate change and the fact that we're allowing industrial logging to still occur in these critical habitats. And even with like, as I said, science is ambiguous in terms of like the impacts that predator control can have on these caribou populations. But even, if the science was clear and said like, I essentially want to make the point that like science alone cannot dictate policy. So when, even when we look at like the grizzly bear trophy hunts might be a more simple example of like, even if the research, which it was, we can't necessarily conclude that it was, but if say it was sustainable to harvest a certain number of grizzly bears, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay to do that. And that kind of brings in like principles from environmental ethics, where it's does not mean ought, or does not imply ought, meaning that just because we can doesn't mean we should. And that's where like, that kind of principle has been around in Western ethics for, 2,500 years. And it's something that we need to consider in these conversations. Like, of course, like science is so important in informing policy and guiding us, but then we also need to think about kind of the ethics behind that and whether or not it's morally right to kind of to kill a mass number of animals.
Well, and like, yeah, there's all these like from a policy level, like it all comes down to like driving towards minimums. It's like, well, how many wolves do we need to sustain this population? How many caribou do we need to sustain this population? And like you said, like we don't know what kind of ecosystems we're going to have in like 50 to 100 years. There's a lot of like speculation based on science and climate models and all this, but ultimately we don't know. So it's like, you think that the safest thing would be to just like keep these ecosystems robust so that they can adapt and evolve with the changing climate that we still don't have a full grasp on what's exactly going to happen. It's like, that's what allows things to survive. Like extinction events happen when things can't adapt fast enough to changes. If we, keep that robust diversity of species and genetics and everything within a population of or within an ecosystem, whether that's the population of trees to caribou to wolves to lichen to snails on the ground, like we theoretically can create a system that's going to be able to evolve and adapt to these changes that come.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
And then this goes back to the thing with logging. It's like, yeah, we need to stop logging. We need to like protect these wolves. We need to protect these ecosystems. But in a capitalist society, like, how do you make money protecting wolves?
Mm-hmm.
It pays to log.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex topic, and I think there's a lot of research to support kind of like the ecological benefits of having wolves on the land. Like, of course, it's, we can't apply it across the board. There's these particular regions, especially with wolves and caribou, that like, yeah, okay, how can we justify the economic value? But there are a lot of, there's emerging research to support, the economic value of having wolves and other predators like bears on the land in terms of like ecotourism, which for bears, grizzly bears, for example, is like a much more economically valuable organization than like, say, trophy hunting. But I mean, all that being said, like their economic value, their ecological value, it's also their intrinsic value. And I think that's something that you don't see at all mentioned in policy or these kind of conversations where it's like, these animals, these living beings, just like an ecosystem has its intrinsic value, the living plants and trees and the animals within that ecosystem also have intrinsic value. And it's just kind of unfortunate that it's part of our society that we're always looking at kind of how do these animals benefit us? And with predators, it's often what is the minimum number that we can sustain for them to still benefit us in a way. And that, the economics are tough, and hopefully I have faith that there's people working towards methods that are going to like work towards more sustainable methods. But I also, it's a tough place to be in. Because
like at the end of the day, like this whole issue between caribou and wolves exists because of excessive logging, excessive industrial logging. You think that the easiest way to stop it would just be to stop the logging, but then there's like lobbying groups for logging that like keep policy in action. There's like, there's so many different excuses people use from jobs to livelihood to like quote unquote culture, like logging town culture to like keep this thing going. But like it's so obvious that you're like dwindling down to a very distinct endpoint. It's like, at what point do you just stop and be like, okay, let's think about this a little bit differently and learn how to do this differently. Like you can still create culture. Like culture is a choice. It's not dictated. Like you can choose how to create like your town community. You can choose how to build an economy and an infrastructure and bring people together. Like the lack of like willingness to adapt to changing times, I think is going to be like the nail in the coffin to many of these communities, because they just want to keep things the same, and nothing stays the same in this world. Like everything is always changing. Yeah. So how do we adapt?
Yeah, and I think in terms of wolves, it's really trying to change opinions and change the way people think about wolves. And that can be done in many different ways, but I think even just like getting that information to children too, of like kind of starting that foundation of like, these are wolves, these are why they're so amazing. And to kind of inspire that compassion and love towards them, because these are the children of the future. And I think it's important to try and change the minds of other generations too, but it definitely gets more difficult the older folks get and the more ingrained their values are. But I think those perceptions and opinions and that hatred and fear of wolves is really what's kind of holding us back from conserving them and treating them in a respectful way.
Okay, so coming from a solutions perspective, like, do you think a lot of the solutions lie in the social realm like that? Like talking about just like shifting social perceptions around wolves?
I think so. Yeah. And I think that's partially why research is really important, so that we can continue to further our scientific understanding of wolves and share that with folks, and really inspire more of a respect or even just tolerance. Like, not everyone has to love wolves. Not everyone is an animal lover or a nature lover, but just to have like tolerance for them can, I think, really have an impact in terms of coexistence. And especially given, like, yes, a lot of, I guess now I'm thinking about your question about coyotes in urban spaces and wolves in urban spaces, and I'm like thinking of examples in Vancouver Island. It's like there are, wolves do enter into urban spaces in those, when they, especially when there's like food sources available, when people don't maintain their garbage or
But like, what kind of urban settings are you talking about? Like not like downtown Victoria.
I mean, there's smaller communities, like, like in the Tofino Euclid region.
Right, but they're like villages,
Yeah, so very small
like
communities.
population's like 1,200 people.
But there's still like a huge impact on, like, essentially, like, we've seen wolves enter into those communities, and right away you see like a huge divide between like the ones that want to conserve and protect the wolves, the wolf lovers, and the wolf haters that are like, let's hire some trappers and some hunters and get them out of our community. And so it happens in those smaller urban spaces. It happens in, more remote kind of communities as well. And so there's more interactions with humans, and just understanding like what can be done to coexist, because we just have that responsibility where, like, we know, like, there's going to be more conflict if there's food around. That could be garbage, that could be hand feeding wolves, that could be livestock, and we have a lot of knowledge that can equip us with coexisting and tolerating wolves.
Well, and tools for like mitigating that. It's like lock up your garbage, get like a guard dog for your cattle.
Yeah.
There's like different ways to like not have those negative interactions. I guess like so many different things that we kind of face today, it's just about kind of changing or shifting the social perspective on it. It's like any long-lived thing that like exists within a population. It's like you can't just like change a mind like that with like one conversation. It's just like this slow, persistent, like you just have to keep engaging, keep informing. And like when people come out with rhetoric like, let's hire the trappers or let's like cull all these wolves, like they're gonna destroy our community. So you just have to be able to be persistently optimistic and willing to like engage with people that are very difficult to engage with at times.
Yeah, and it's figuring out effective messaging too, because I think a lot of like in those kind of stakeholder groups like hunters and trappers or ranchers, like they don't want to be told what they should and shouldn't do, especially from someone that lives in an urban setting and doesn't experience it firsthand. But a lot of, and that's important, like a lot of this work that I think has been successful too is like, really like working on those relationships and creating trust, and, having folks that can relate to those situations and really collaborating on those things instead of being like, like telling someone what they should and shouldn't do without kind of really hearing their concerns and their problems, because people want to be heard, and they're not gonna, just based off of like, oh, we found this in this peer-reviewed journal and this is what has been successful, so you should do it. Like, it requires a lot more than that, and like just engagement and building relationships is important. Totally.
And especially like from a policy level, like that's something that won't be received well either. If all of a sudden there's like a new law that says you can't hunt wolves freely, people would be like, what do you mean? Yeah.
So that would be great though.
Yeah, I guess from like a policy level, like what are the kind of the next steps? Like what are the things that that Raincoast is working on, that people are working on? Like what are we trying? What's kind of like the goal from a policy level here to create change?
I mean, our ultimate goal would be to end the killing of wolves for trophy, sport, perceived competition for prey. And when I say those things, that essentially encompasses a lot of the like when we talk about recreational hunting. Sometimes I don't like to use the term recreational because I think a lot of hunters and trappers wouldn't say that they're going out there just to recreate. There's definitely, you know, drives for trophy and sport, but a lot of it is, you know, that competition for shared prey. Like wolves are hunting the same species that hunters and trappers are going for. But our goal is to end, you know, the hunting and trapping of, or the hunting of wolves, and predator control, kill programs like what the BC government does. And it's obviously like a big goal, and there's a lot of small things that could happen to help along the way, but at the same time, we don't want to compromise. I think that's what can happen in these kind of long-term conservation goals where you're fighting for so long and you just want to win, but you just don't want to compromise as well. But there's a lot of things like in terms of hunting, of even like having a species tag would be beneficial in some ways to just understand how many wolves are being killed. And I mean, it's tough because there's just not a lot of capacity with like enforcement of any type of rules. And that's
with any government kind of thing. Yeah.
And that's why like wolf poaching can be a real problem in some regions. And
but it's crazy because like you say that there's not a lot of money for enforcement of like things like that, but then wolf culling isn't cheap either. Like you mentioned, like they're hunters, like flying out of helicopters. Helicopters aren't cheap to run. You wrote that there was that op-ed thing you did in the Times, I believe it was.
Yeah, the Times Colonist.
Yeah, like
So it's definitely expensive. I think in 1 year, I think it was the 2019-2020 year, there was an average in one region. I think it averaged out to about $4,300 per wolf. But in like one region, one caribou herd, it averaged to like $10,000 per wolf. And it was
per wolf. And how many wolves were killed? Like
that one was the very high year. That was like 463. And I think the government ended up spending about $2 million.
Oh my
It's
God.
often about $1 million, I think, on average, but
in a year.
In a year.
And so, and the program's been operating for how long now?
Since 2015, but the practices of like sterilization and bounties and like just mass killing of predators has gone on kind of unofficially for many like decades before that as well. But this is kind of like, you know, the official program started in 2015.
Right. As far as like a government use of money goes, like they're spending millions of dollars to cull these wolves. Yet at the same time, you're saying the solution would be like, you know, creating wolf tags or doing like other things that would require government money just being spent in a different way. Like we say that there's no resources for like, you know, officers to like check the tags and stuff, but it's like, of course there's not going to be any resources when you're spending millions of dollars culling the wolves. Like you're already invested in like one sort of like quote unquote management system without entertaining the ideas of others.
Yeah, and I don't think like implementing a species tag would necessarily help. It's just like if it's going to happen, to be able to like have that data to understand the extent of wolf mortality would be helpful. But it's like there's, you know, a common claim with like wolf hunting is that like if we allow the hunting of wolves, there'll be a greater tolerance for their presence and existence, which has been talked about a lot and kind of deconstructed in philosophical conversations and arguments, and it just that we don't see that like there isn't an increase in tolerance when we're allowed more lenient rules in regarding to the hunting of wolves.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear that argument. So they say like because you hunt wolves, you have a greater appreciation for them?
No, well, there's the argument that if we allow the hunting of wolves, like if we allow, I think part of the argument would be like, yeah, if I'm allowed to hunt a wolf, like in a lot of, you know, when folks go out and hunt ungulates, and a lot of the hunting experience and hunters will say like, I have more respect for that animal. So I think that's part of the argument, but through research, like we haven't seen that tolerance that tolerance doesn't increase with hunting. There isn't the connection there.
Well, I think it's a disconnect too, because when you're going out and you're hunting ungulates like that, you're, doing it for food.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, yeah, you respect the animal more, but then you're also like eating it through the winter. You have like you're using its antlers, like you're making use of it, whereas the hunt for wolves are still seen as like pest driven. It's like, we need to eradicate these, get rid of them, because they're annoying, scary, harmful, whatever.
Yeah.
So it is like shifting that mindset.
Yeah, I think that's the key, and it's going to be a long process. I think it's just really important to celebrate the small accomplishments, but yeah, shifting public perception and just through education and teaching people about like how wolves are, because a lot of people have no idea that wolves are treated this way, and that the government has this program, and that hunters are allowed to kill wolves in the masses. There's just, I think, just kind of informing the public about that. And because we do have the public, our stakeholders in how we conserve and manage our populations, and, polling shows in terms of like trophy hunting that like the mass majority of British Columbians don't support trophy hunting. They support hunting for food, but they don't support trophy hunting. And I like the hunting of wolves, if not for food, is, in that sense for trophy. And I think just, getting the word out there more, and just kind of having more conversations about it is important, and just trying to shift that kind of social acceptance of wolves. Yeah.
What are some of like the barriers that you guys have like come up against with like getting like policy changes or anything like that? Have you had like a lot of communities with people in like small rural areas? Like,
I think the main barrier, I'm trying to think, like, for wolf management, I think what we're trying to do in terms of like being able to bring information to decision makers, and because there's just, with wolf management, there's a lot of influence and sway with different stakeholders like hunters and trappers and ranchers that have like a really strong voice in these decisions. And that's where like a challenge is to get decision makers to really like focus on the science and the ethical arguments towards like the treatment of wolves. And just really like in the management plan, they talk about the ecological role of wolves, but it's just not emphasized enough. Like they have such a profound role, and I don't think that's considered enough in the management plan. So it's kind of just trying to engage decision makers and really like shift towards that management for wolves versus management of wolves. Like, we're not really doing anything to conserve them. There's no land that's protected for them except for national parks, which is like a small percentage of the land in North America. And like still those wolves that live within those national parks are still subject to lethal methods if they cross those boundaries, is what we've seen a lot recently in Yellowstone as well. But yeah, it's just kind of shifting those traditional ways of management to manage for like the ecosystem, the holistic landscape approach to management versus just managing more so for industry.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I find that it's a bit of a ruse where like the government doesn't do a lot for conservation measures like in general, and when they do come in, like in this case, it's done under the guise of like protecting caribou populations, which is like a big thing. Like we definitely need to like be addressing and conserving caribou populations. But it's the fact that like they've used this as kind of like the scapegoat, as like the reason and the way that that's going to happen, as opposed to addressing the bigger issues that like science shows is like the real issues are like lack of caribou habitat. It's just, it just goes back to the money. And even from like a conservationist perspective, like I know quite a few people who are like avid outdoorsy people that like love the caribou, and they hate wolves because that's been kind of like the story fed to them, is that like the wolf population is killing the caribou. And it's like, they are, but like kind of by circumstance of that we've created, you know?
Yeah. And it's also like these wolves need to eat too. I find it interesting when people hate so much on wolves because they're preying upon an animal to like feed themselves for survival, feed their families. And why do, hunters, trappers, or industry have more right to those species than they do? Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to conservation ethics too. It's like, if we are doing it for the caribou, but we're still logging caribou habitat, like, is it ethical to keep caribou like alive in that way? Like, we're basically just like allowing them to slowly starve to death. Whether or not the wolves are killing them, we're still destroying their habitat.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of putting them in these kind of unnatural conditions to try and bolster their populations. And then kind of, and because they really just, we need to be focusing on restoring and protecting their habitat, because that's what they need. It's not just a numbers thing. We can't kind of bolster their numbers and then release them into an environment that's not going to favor them.
Exactly. That's not nice for the caribou.
No.
Nor is it nice to the wolves. They're just trying to get by. Everybody's just trying to get by.
Yeah. Make a living.
Yeah.
Survive.
One day at a time.
Yeah.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Did you have anything else that you would like to chat about?
I mean, we could talk a little bit about the research that Raincoast is doing.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So we kind of initiated a research project along the South Coast, and I'd love to share like more details about the specific location, but I think it's also important to be transparent and kind of acknowledge like why we're being, more secretive about the location, because there's wolf populations in this region. There is, high levels of hunting activity, and we just, it's important to acknowledge that like us sharing and making it public of like the locations of our research can really put these wolves in jeopardy. And also following like our, the First Nation community that we are collaborating with, and the territories in which we're doing our research, respecting their wishes too, because they have very similar concerns with the protection of these wolf populations and making sure we're not putting them at risk. So in general, like our research is, along the South Coast, and it kind of stemmed from like this region of, of close collaborating and colleague that was like, hey, we have wolves in this area. We're doing work here. We're doing restoration work. And like, there's wolves here and we have there's no information on them. And so we saw a great opportunity to kind of get in there and start monitoring them. And so we have like 15 camera traps up there. And then we also have acoustic recorders. And so the idea, we're in our pilot year, and the idea would be to try and capture as many wolves on camera as we can, hopefully some wolf howls as well, to kind of continue applying and also advancing non-invasive techniques, which is really a really important component of our conservation ethics, to ensure that, research is we're going to have an impact either way, just by being present in these wolf habitats. They're very, sensitive, intelligent animals, and like any change in their environment, like they're going to be aware of it. So even cameras, which I'm learning a lot firsthand, although they're minimally invasive, like wolves are very aware that they're there, and they often like they can be really curious and come right up to the camera.
Is that like a human scent thing? You think they can smell whoever planted it? They're like, what is this person doing?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I've learned to like wash my hands and spray the equipment really well, mostly for bears. Bears just love to chomp on cameras.
Interesting. I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
definitely like the human scent, but also just like it's a new thing in the environment. Like, what is this? I want to check it out. So like we see wolves come up and like, sniff and investigate the cameras, but then we also see them like really avoid them, especially at night with kind of, I'm seeing on the cameras like the younger wolves don't seem to really pay attention to the cameras, but a lot of the older wolves, you can kind of see them like they're moving so quickly through the cameras. So it's important to kind of acknowledge that, like, as we constantly kind of reassess our research and conservation ethics and what our impact is when we go into the field, into these habitats, and like how we can potentially influence the behavior and movements of these animals.
Is there like a thermal camera type thing? I'm thinking like nocturnal stuff would be, if you could put one up higher where they wouldn't even bother smelling, but you could like look down on a forest section, be able to like see, like thermally track wolves moving through. Just an idea. I don't know.
Yeah. So with like these cameras, they're censored. So like they're censored to, they react, they'll be triggered with like movement and heat. Essentially, if you put like a camera up on a tree, that means that kind of like the line of sight or the line of like the sensor will be a lot smaller. So, I mean, this would be a really good place to put a camera for a wolf, because it's just like you can kind of see this path, and it's like an easy way to kind of travel, maybe exploit that, like the use of that road over there. But you'd want to place it at kind of chest height to the wolf and it depends what your questions are too, but like if you put it high on the tree, there's less chance it's going to be triggered because the angle essentially for what the wolf has to cross.
I was thinking like high looking down, like I'm thinking like big wide fish angle, like, and not just 20 feet up, like, you get it up there. But if it's like a thermal camera, you don't have to rely on the images as much, because like the body heat, like you can see when like a pack moves or how they move.
Yeah.
It's different data, I guess, but like.
Yeah, and one of the things,
just spitballing here.
Yeah, I think you just, like, depending on what you want to know about the animals, because we want to kind of get to know these individuals to be able to identify them. And when you put it at chest level, you have a better idea of the size of the wolf, better imaging of like the unique markings on their face, on their body. But then you also have the acoustic recorders to complement that. And the acoustic recorders, I think, are like one of the most like non-invasive, because you place them higher in a tree. They're just like super tiny and they don't have a flash or anything. But I've been finding that it's harder to actually capture wolf howls, but that also depends on the season, because they can be a lot more vocal when you go into like the fall and the winter and into breeding season.
And then that's still only capturing like one type of behavior.
Yeah.
Which is awesome though. That's cool.
Yeah.
Gotta imagine you must just go through a ton of batteries and memory cards and.
Yeah. So I'm
having trouble doing an hour-long interview. I guess it's like almost 2 hours now, but.
Oh, is it?
Batteries and memory are the bane of my existence.
Yeah. No, it's definitely the bane of my existence for this project, because the area that we're researching is not the most accessible. The cost of like getting up there and staying there is like a huge chunk of the budget. And so like the acoustic recorders that I have, they're called Audio Moss, and they're like kind of a newer technology that's more affordable and open source. But they only last about like 2 to 3 weeks. And it's like, it's not feasible to get up there that often based on the cost and just the logistics.
And there's no way to plug them into like an external power source, get a little battery pack up there and supplement it. I don't know.
I mean, I'm looking into other devices that have this option for like a lithium lid that can essentially, I think the estimated time is like more like 2.5 to 3 months. They're just a lot more expensive, but like when you kind of think about the expenses of going up there, it makes a lot of sense. And then they're also more sensitive. So these ones, there hasn't been a lot of like, I think they've only been used to kind of test the distance that they can capture wolf howls in like a couple studies. But it's more like, maybe 500 meters versus like this acoustic recorder I'm looking at from Song Meter is much more sensitive. I think some studies have found more of a radius of like 3 kilometers, but that all changes and varies with topography, humidity,
forest density,
rain, forest density, all that. So yeah, so learning a lot about the
a
technology.
lot of variables.
Yeah.
Isn't that fun? You get into something because you love it, and then you're just like inundated with like tech info, and you're just like, I don't know what these numbers mean.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but it's super fun going through camera trap data.
Right.
Every time I see a wolf, it's so exciting.
I bet.
And then there's
Are you just there like flipping through images, just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then like suddenly it's jackpot and there's a wolf in there?
Well, ideally, if you had like the perfect spot that had, no small plants blowing in the wind, triggering your cameras, you'd have like a compilation of photos that was just wildlife or maybe humans as well. But what I've experienced, I set up the cameras in April and didn't really think about all the growth that would happen. I had like this really good spot on a Forest Service road that had like bobcat, elk, deer, cougars, wolves, bears, all kind of just walking past. And like I slowly watched these ferns just like unravel and grow like right in front of the camera.
Yeah. You got to put like a big boulder or something right in front of it.
Yeah, the last time I went back, we put some logs in front of it. But yeah, and then it gets so hot in this region. Like the temperature on some of the cameras got up to 46 degrees.
Oh, no way. Like in the little housing?
Yeah. Like,
I feel like that's enough to fry some electronics.
I know, but I think like they're, designed to kind of measure the external temperature, but it was very shocking to see that in certain areas and just like thinking about the wildlife. But then because of like that heat and the wind, like all these, it triggers the cameras a lot. So I've probably gone through like tens of thousands of false triggers. So it makes it more exciting when I see an animal.
Yeah. I can imagine those are slow days in the office. It's like tick, 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 tick. And you mentioned before when we were talking prior to recording that like the nation you're working with is interested in a lot of like restoration in general, like for fish habitat, rivers and stuff. So there's like a good amount of like, I guess, resources going into this. Yeah.
And I guess a lot of the work that's being done in that area has heavily focused on habitat restoration for salmon. The nation up there, salmon are culturally important for them. And the restoration work is important too because that region is heavily logged. It's been logged since the 30s and continues to be logged. And they've seen, certain events happen where like, you have these clear cuts that destabilize the soil and can lead to landslides. And they've seen landslides, take out really critical salmon habitat. So a lot of their work, like before we've just started our work just over the past year, but they've been up there for the nation has been up there for thousands of years, but their kind of organization that is helping them with the habitat restoration has been there for a few years now, and it's been really cool to see like all the work that they've done of just restoring these streams and seeing like the first year we were up there, they're like in the first stages of restoring a stream that had just been dug out, didn't have anything in it, but there was rainfall and sockeye had already made their way into the stream. It's like if you make habitat for salmon, they will be there, especially with coho.
Wait, so they were creating a stream? They were like digging out a new stream or like taking debris out of a filled stream?
I think they base it off of like what looks like it would have been a historical channel and go from there. And then, there's all these different components of like engineering the stream and adding like woody debris and these kind of more shallow ponds with protection from predators.
Which is huge. I mean, circling back to, again, the interconnectivity of everything, it's like, you've logged the hillsides that's now leaching sediments and debris in the form of landslides and rock slides, gravel, inundating these rivers, filling it up. The only way you're going to stabilize that, like, you can plant trees on it, but like you need the big, healthy, mature, complex forest to like really stabilize that hillside. And the only way you're going to get those big, mature trees is like first of all, letting the trees live for more than 50, 60, 70 years before you come back and harvest them again, but also having healthy salmon runs that populations of wolves and bears can bring that rich nitrogen source into the forest to deposit and help grow those big giant trees that it's going to hold it all together, you know?
Yeah.
It's the trickle down effect. You can't do one thing and expect it to just work out fine. Like, you have to address all levels of an ecosystem, whether that's just like your salmon to your caribou to your wolves to your trees.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what we're really interested in as well. Like, kind of understanding and building off of research that's been done to kind of understand the impact that salmon have on these riparian zones and bringing these marine drive nutrients into the soil. And then the impact that these predators have, like wolves, like bears and cougars, of bringing these carcasses into the forests and leaving them for other animals to forage on, but also decompose into the forest and provide those nutrients like nitrogen, and also like looking into carbon storage, like what that impact has on carbon storage is kind of one of the avenues that we're kind of headed in and really excited about. And
the carbon storage avenue.
Yeah.
Salmon are awesome to me because they just, like, I don't fish or anything. I like rarely even eat fish. But just like the symbolic nature of them, just like the way that like all these ecosystems all throughout Cascadia, you know, like even through the interior, the fact that a fish can come from all the way out in the Pacific, wherever it's been, and like make its way like into Alberta almost, it's just nuts.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more and more about salmon. One of the first times we were up in this region, I saw my first sockeye salmon run, which was really cool. Yeah. Yeah, they're so beautiful with their colors and their hooked noses. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it becomes one of those difficult things to really fully build out the whole complexity of the ecosystem, because we never really had a full understanding of the baseline like 200 years ago, you know, so we don't even really know what we're working for. It's just like a little bit at a time, like kind of fitting the pieces of this, like it's like having like a broken lamp that you're trying to put back together, but you don't know how the lamp ever looked, so you're just like, you have these random pieces, like, I think this fits here, like maybe, oh yeah, it could go there.
Yeah,
you're just trying to make it happen as you do.
Yeah, it's just such an interesting region because of like you said, it's like it's being broken in so many ways.
It's not just like one thing's going to fix it.
Yeah. And just like the resilience of the fact that we're seeing these populations of elk and deer and all these predators, just trying to understand like this multi-predator, multi-prey system. And it's so interesting just even being able to study wolves in like a salmon bearing watershed, because that can really disrupt the relationship between wolves and ungulates, because this like abundance of salmon throughout the year or throughout like, you know, the latter half of the year.
Well, and then even when you think about dynamics between predators, it's like, you know, people think of bears and wolves as being like the biggest predators, but bears will primarily just go for fish and berries. Like they'll eat like deer and stuff if it's like injured, wounded, or if they're scavenging, but they really don't compete for the same resources. It's like, that's a completely different like balance of resources within an ecosystem.
Yeah. Any
places where you would like to direct people for more information about wolves and the work that you do?
Yeah. I mean, I work with Raincoast Conservation Foundation, and I coordinate the wolf conservation program. So our website has, you know, a lot of the research that we've been conducting over the years, a lot of important information. I have plans, you know, hopefully this fall we've done an educational webinar called Wolf School a couple of years back, and I'm trying to continue that on. So hopefully that'll happen this fall. So just to keep their eyes and ears out for that. And we're working on kind of a conservation ethics web article series. So essentially like interviews in a web article format, and it'll be kind of hopefully a long series to kind of just really engage the public and improve understanding around conservation ethics and how it applies to the killing of wolves and other predators, to just kind of continue conversations about that and really emphasize the important role that ethics plays in the conversation.
Totally. Are there any researchers out there, like individual researchers or people that are like doing great things with wolves you'd like to shout out to?
Yeah.
Or suggest people follow? Or
our so we're lab affiliated, university affiliated. So we have the Applied Conservation Science Lab out of UVic, run by Dr. Chris Darramont, who's our research director for Raincoast. So a lot of their work is focused in the Great Bear, and historically have done amazing work on wolves, are currently doing a lot of work on bears as well. And so any of the work that his PhD students and master students are doing is pretty amazing. And I would definitely recommend to check it out. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of amazing work that's being done. Heather Bryant, Kyle Artell, these are all kind of Raincoast affiliates that are great researchers and are doing great work in collaboration with a lot of First Nations communities as well. And that's also kind of what I want to emphasize too about Raincoast, and even the research that we're doing is part of our mandate and what we do. We're, a group of conservationists and scientists that are empowered by our research that we do on the lands and waters and wildlife of BC. But a huge part of that, and what we coined the term kind of informed advocacy, is not only being informed by the scientific research we do, but also by community engagement and our long-lasting collaborations and relationships with Indigenous nations. And, for the research that I kind of briefly talked about, that's been such an important component, is that we make sure that the research we're doing is supported by the nation and is, following the priorities of the nation. So a lot of what we do, we love to we want to, get our work out there and contribute to the scientific community. But first and foremost, what is our relationship with those nations and the research that we're doing in their territories, and making sure that it is in line with, their wishes and their priorities.
Mm-hmm. It's a good two-eyed way of conservation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Seeing conservation.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And I guess the final thing is just doing all you can to debunk the hysteria and the mass demonization of wolves.
Yeah.
Anytime you see a movie where a wolf is depicted as this negative, evil thing, just freaking scrap that.
Yeah. And it's cool. There are some children's books that have come out. I can't recall the name of this particular one, that have tried to kind of shift the narrative and talk about wolves in a more positive light, sending more positive messages. And a lot of my colleagues at Raincoast, we've talked a lot about we just love to create a series of children's books, because our programs are so interwoven and connected. And when we really think about, so we have a wild salmon program, the Lower Fraser salmon program, the wolf program. We have a new Healthy Waters program. We have a new cetacean research program. We have a Gulf Islands Forest Project program. And all of these things, we were just chatting the other day about, whatever project we're doing, even the research that we're doing that I talked about earlier, all of our programs could go up there and have some type of impact, because it's all so connected. And we're really trying to emphasize this land to sea connection, where, through healthy water and healthy salmon populations, you could follow the Chinook, a Chinook from the Salish Sea up into the Lower Fraser, up into one of the tributaries where they spawn, and these terrestrial mammals or predators bring these carcasses into the forest and bolster forest productivity, and essentially help with that whole healthy ecosystem is going to impact the healthy environment for that spawning salmon and that red to then produce a salmon that's going to travel back through the river into the Salish Sea and feed southern resident killer whales. And it's all so connected. And I think that's what makes it really exciting to work at Raincoast, is that we can like there isn't this separation between programs, and we're all so excited to learn about what everyone's doing, because it really does impact our own work. And I think it's just what we need in that, how we approach conservation. We need to think holistically and take more of that like landscape approach versus thinking about these kind of small components.
Totally. And again, at the same time, kind of shifting our perspective on our role in it too. I feel like we as a society are like now at a new point when we're trying to like relearn all these things that Indigenous nations have known since time immemorial, that we are like so intricately connected to these ecosystems, and we're like still learning about all the different ways that these ecosystems work and like our role in it. And we can't come across as like, or we shouldn't interact as like some sort of big decider that comes in and like makes, you know, decisions and moves that help us only, because those impacts that we have are going to trickle down to all these other systems that are ultimately going to affect us. So it's like we have to understand that like we aren't above any of this. We are like intricately a part of it.
Yeah.
I think it's like, and learning and understanding it is just all part of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Wow. Well, sure. Cool, don't you think? I'm going to go ahead and throw some links to Raincoast Conservation, as well as a few of the other resources that Chelsea mentioned, into the show notes here, so you can all look those up. And if you enjoyed this week's podcast episode, as well as all the fun videos you see on Nerdy About Nature social media channels, you can help support their production by becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/nerdyboutnature, or check out nerdyboutnature.com for more ways to support. All of this goes towards creating some financial stability for me, so I can continue creating all this fun, free, educational content that you're all enjoying so much. Big thanks to Chelsea for coming on this week's episode, and of course to each and every one of you for tuning in. I hope you learned something, hope you enjoyed it, hope you got something out of it, and I hope to catch you next time on the Nerdy About Nature podcast. Until then, take it easy.